Hey class, it's Mr. Stewart. This is going to be your integrity video for Chapter 1 for CRJ 100 Intro to Criminal Justice. This week it's more or less going to be kind of an introduction to the class, an introduction to the text. You're not going to see me talking this week. You should just be hearing me, and you should be seeing the PowerPoint for Chapter 1. What I will typically do is construct a video for every week over the chapters that we're going to cover, and if you look at the discussion boards, you're going to see which chapters we're going to be talking about each particular week. And then if you look in the content modules tab, you're going to see the PowerPoints and the to-do list for each week. So the discussions will tell you what chapters to read, and the content modules will give you the PowerPoints and what to do each week of the course. So this first integrity video is not going to be too lengthy. I will be getting more in depth as we go on, but this is going to be talking about some of the high points in Chapter 1, which is criminal justice today. Trying to get my PowerPoint to advance here. Here we go. The first thing it's going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about this here for just a minute, is the two most common models of how society determines what acts are considered criminal or not. And basically there's two ways that society looks at a particular behavior to determine whether it's considered right or considered wrong. The first way is using what we call the consensus model. And what the consensus model is that basically it's a majority vote. This assumes that even a diverse group of people can have similar morals and share an ideal of what they consider to be right or wrong. And crimes then are acts that violate this particular value system that this group of people has. This is the way that most people assume that our laws come into play and come into being, is because, hey, we got together as people, we elected lawmakers, and the lawmakers are representative of us, and then they determine what laws should be made, what should be considered a crime, and what should not be considered a crime. Basically, which behaviors are okay and which behaviors are not considered okay. And it's based on this whole idea that the majority of people would agree on that. For example, murder, killing someone. Most people would agree that that's wrong and you shouldn't do it. That should be a crime. And if we elect a lawmaker, and the lawmaker, along with the rest of the lawmakers that are elected nationwide, get together and they say, yes, killing someone is wrong, so we should have a law against it. That's how we come up with the crime of murder. Not every law, unfortunately, is based upon the consensus model. Some of them are based on something called the conflict model. And this particular model is almost the polar opposite of consensus. This assumes that diverse groups of people do not share moral attitudes, and the people who have power within society are the ones that have the influence on what behaviors or acts are considered criminal or not. This particular model is based on basically Karl Marx and his idea of communism, where it says that, hey, we're the government, we are the elite, we are the ruling class, and we know better for you than you know for you. So therefore, we are going to decide what is okay behavior and what is not okay behavior. Another way to look at the conflict model would be from basically the perspective of those that have versus those that have not. The ruling class versus the working class. Now think about this. If you're the ruling class, if you have the money and the power within society, don't you want to keep that? Of course you do. So with that being said, if you have the money and the power and you want to keep it, who doesn't have the money and the power? That's the working class. And if you don't have money and power, you want to get some. So that in and of itself causes a conflict between those two classes of people. So the working class want the power and the money. They're trying to get it. The ruling class have the power and the money, and they don't want to let go of it. So therefore, the ruling class makes behaviors criminal because they can. They do it as a way to oppress the working class and to keep them from getting their power and the money. They do it as a way for the ruling class to keep the power and the money. So basically, in and of itself, this is a conflict between two socioeconomic classes of people. Now, this sounds, plausible, and we know that certain laws have been passed based upon this whole idea of the ruling class versus the working class. And I'm going to leave it up to you to come up with some examples of that in the discussion board. But it's based on the idea that we only have two classes. And that's what communism is based on, that we only have two classes of people. It does not take into consideration that we even have a middle class, which is somewhere between the ruling class and the working class. They have some power and some money. They don't have all the power and the money, but they have some of it. So basically in the United States, because we have a middle class, the conflict model doesn't work so well, although we do have some laws that have been passed using that particular model. But the majority of our laws, in my opinion, would come from the consensus model, where everybody agrees on what behaviors are okay or not okay. Hopefully you can understand that. That should make that a little more clear. So what is a crime? And you've got here on the slide basically what's considered an integrated definition of crime, or several different definitions of crime. Basically, it's anything that the society says is not okay behavior. It is something you can be punished for because we have a law against it. It can be an offense against a person. It can also be an offense against society as a whole. You don't have to have an actual victim. For example, prostitution is considered a victimless crime. It's not a victimless crime because society is the victim, but there's not a particular specific person we can point to say that there is a victim. And typically, a crime is also defined as something that when we punish you for it, we can take away your rights, some of your rights, such as putting you in jail, taking away your freedom or something like that. So make sure you read that section in the text. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just trying to clear up any muddy water there. Criminal behavior can be grouped into different categories. This is pretty self-explanatory as well. Violent crime, property crime, public order crime, white-collar crime, organized crime, high-tech crime. The one thing I want you to understand is that these categories are not mutually exclusive. Some crimes can fit into more than one category at the same time. For example, murder would be violent crime, but if it's a murder being carried out by a mobster, somebody who's in a gang of some sort, then that would also be organized crime. If a gang is or the mob is carrying out cybercrime, that's high-tech crime, but it could also be considered organized crime. So not every single crime neatly fits in every one of these categories independently. Sometimes, in fact, many crimes can fit into more than one category. It just depends upon the context in which that crime is perpetrated. Also, you need to understand that there are three major components to the criminal justice system. And when we talk about the criminal justice system, it's really kind of a loosely organized system that encompasses the police, it encompasses the courts, and then it encompasses corrections. All of it taken as a whole is considered the criminal justice system, although each one of these components are very specific as to what they do. For example, the law enforcement is simply that. They enforce the laws that have been generated by the legislative branch of government. And then once somebody has broken the law, we hand them over to the judicial branch, which is the courts. They interpret the law, determine if the person is guilty or not guilty, and then mete out a punishment. And then we hand them back over to the executive branch of government, which is corrections, to carry out the punishment. And so what this effectively does is that it separates the power so that no one entity of the criminal justice system is all powerful. And this is what we call federalism. Law enforcement, this is really simple. Most of you probably know this already, but law enforcement can be divided into local law enforcement, state level law enforcement, and understand that local and state law enforcement typically enforce the same larger set of laws. And then you're going to have federal law enforcement, and federal law enforcement has a very narrow window of laws that they enforce, and they're typically only federal laws. Local and state law enforcement do not enforce federal laws. Federal law enforcement do not enforce state laws. That's why they're independent of each other. Now they work together a lot, and sometimes the exact same offense could be a violation of state law as well as a violation of federal law. In that case, we may choose which branch basically that pursues that case, and typically it's whichever one has the most severe punishment. In the United States, we have a dual court system, and that also means that we have a federal court system that handles those cases generated by federal law enforcement, and then each state has their own state-level court system that handles all of those cases that the local and the state law enforcement brings. Okay, sorry about that. Had somebody come in my office. So we were talking about the United States has a dual court system, which means a federal system and each state, including Washington, D.C., has their own basically state level or state type of system. Now, we also have local courts, and those local courts are maybe city courts or local traffic courts, but and sometimes the officers at those local levels are also enforcing local ordinances or things of that nature, which are basically local laws, which means if you get convicted, you probably don't go to jail for it, you just have to pay a fine. But the same officers are also enforcing the state laws in their particular jurisdictions, in their cities and their counties, and all of that actually goes through the state level court system as well. And each court system has a trial court level, an appeals court level, and then basically a final court level. For example, in the federal system, you'll have the U.S. District Court, which is the trial court. You have the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is your appeals court, and then you're going to have the Supreme Court, which is the final court. That's the court of last resort. And the state is the same way. You're going to have different levels of trial courts. Some states have multiple levels of appeals courts, and then every state also has a Supreme Court as well. So we call it a dual court system because they work independently of each other most of the time. Okay. List the essential elements of corrections. Prisons, jails, community corrections, and parole. Jails are reserved basically for people who have been arrested but not yet been to trial, and those people who are convicted of misdemeanor offenses. They will never go to prison for a misdemeanor conviction, and those who have been convicted of felonies who are waiting on prison space to open up. So jails are interesting because you may have a guy and two guys in a cell, and one of them has been convicted and is waiting to go to prison, and the other guy has not even been to trial yet. They're simply accused of a crime and they couldn't get out of jail. So with that being said, jails are inherently fairly dangerous places because of the mix of the different types of inmates you have. Prisons are reserved for people who have been convicted solely of felonies. You don't see anybody who has a misdemeanor conviction only go to prison. So it's reserved for the more severe criminals, the worst of the worst, so to speak. Community corrections are like people who, instead of going to jail or prison, they get probation, which is they have to live by a set of rules or guidelines, report in to an officer, a probation officer, every so often to make sure that they're living under those rules or guidelines, and then if they violate those rules, then they could be sentenced to jail or prison. But it's a way to try to avoid some of the overcrowding in jails and prisons, is to put people on probation. Some of you may know what probation is. Some of you may be on probation or have been on probation. And then finally, the other component of corrections is parole, and that is somebody that goes to prison and then they are allowed to be released from prison before the end of their sentence because they've had good behavior or they've met certain requirements. There's a lot of parolees out there, and basically they're still property of the Department of Correction, and their houses can be searched without a warrant at any time. You can stop that person just to make sure they're not on drugs or alcohol or whatever. So parolees have limited rights, whereas probationers have just as many rights as almost anybody else. But parolees have very limited rights because they've been allowed to leave prison early. Until the end of their sentence, their rights are fairly limited. So let's talk for a minute about the difference between the formal and the informal criminal justice process. Think about the criminal justice system as an assembly line where you go from one point to another. For example, a police officer makes contact with you, you get arrested, he takes you to jail. From jail you go, maybe you bail out, then you have a court date, you go to a court date, they set a trial date, you go to trial, let's say you're found guilty, then you go to a sentencing hearing, you go to the sentencing hearing, they hand out a sentence, you're taken into custody, they put you in prison, you serve a time in prison, and you parole out, or you flatten your sentence, which means you served your entire sentence and you get out of prison. It's just it's very linear, and you go from one step to the next. And you typically don't skip steps either. In a perfect world, that's the way the criminal justice system would work. But because we live in an imperfect world, what we have is huge caseloads, a lot of people getting arrested, long, large dockets for the courts. There's no possible way we can have trials on every single person that gets arrested. There's no possible way we can send everybody to prison. So what we also have is called the informal criminal justice process. And what that means is it's based on the use of discretion. And this allows for people within these different points along the line, so to speak, of the criminal justice process can stop and do something different. For example, if the police officer can decide not to arrest you. He can decide to write you a ticket instead of take you to jail. You can go to court and they can dismiss the charges, or they can work out a plea agreement so that it doesn't have to go to trial. Or let's say you go to trial and you get convicted and you've never been convicted of a crime before. You can ask for diversion, which means, yes, you've been convicted, but we're going to divert you out of the criminal justice process. You're not going to go to prison, and we're going to basically keep this conviction on your record for now, as long as you don't get in trouble for a period of time. And if you don't, then we'll wipe the slate clean and you're not going to go to prison. So this is what allows us to move a large number of cases through the criminal justice system in a timely manner. And timely is relative. Understand that. I mean, sometimes it still takes a while to move through the system, but things will move through the system. But if we did not have the informal process, the system would be so backlogged. It may take 20 years to go to trial for somebody stealing a piece of peppermint candy from the Shell station. That's just it just would be so inefficient because of the backlog of cases that we almost have to have the use of discretion in and with the criminal justice process to allow for some cases to just be moved through the process. Hopefully that makes sense. Learning Objective 6 says, describe the layers of the wedding cake model. Think about the wedding cake, and you should be seeing my cursor move right now. This largest layer here on the bottom would be typically your infractions and misdemeanors. Those are those things like speeding tickets, simple assault, simple possession of drugs, petty theft, etc., etc. The majority of cases that we have in the criminal justice system are misdemeanors, which means you don't go to prison for that. You can only go to jail, county jail, for up to a year and pay a fine of less than $1,000. The majority of the cases that we see are in that realm. The next layer up is going to be more serious cases. It's going to be your felonies, but not really heinous felonies, not really violent felonies, but more serious crimes. Thefts over $500, maybe possession with intent to distribute drugs, things of that nature. You see fewer of those, although those are things you can go to prison for. The next layer up, the third layer up, is smaller, of course, and that's going to be your violent felonies. That's going to be your murders, your rapes, your robberies, sex crimes, things of that nature, which you go to prison for, but they're more serious than the level below them. And then finally, that top layer is going to be what we call celebrated cases. That's going to be like the Casey Anthony case, where she was accused of killing her daughter. That's going to be the O.J. Simpson case, where he was accused of killing his wife and her little buddy. It's going to be those cases that the media picks up on. It makes a lot of headlines. Even though they get a lot of publicity and the media reports on these cases a lot, they're actually very rare. We don't see a lot of those what we call celebrated cases. The majority of the cases we deal with are going to be the non-violent, non-serious crimes. I just want you to understand that. Even though the media reports all that bad stuff all the time, it's not that common. It's actually fairly rare. Please read this section in your textbook on the crime control and due process models. And this is basically how we go about enforcing the law. The crime control model suggests that society has a right to be protected from crime, and we can do whatever we need to do to protect society from crime. And interestingly enough, that sounds pretty good, right? That, hey, the society needs to have the right to do what it needs to do to protect itself from crime. The problem that you have with the crime control model is that it does not respect the rights of everyone. It may try to respect the rights of the innocent, but it really tramples the rights of the accused. And that's a slippery slope. When you start trampling the rights of one group of people, it won't be long until you begin to trample the rights of all groups of people. And so probably a better model to look at crime would be the due process model. And this basically says that the primary emphasis is on the right of the individual to be protected from the power of the government, that everybody has due process. Basically, it says if we protect the rights of the accused, we are also, in turn, protecting the rights of the innocent, of the victims. And that's why many people think, well, the criminals have more rights than the rest of us do. That is not true. They don't. But we do make a big deal out of protecting what rights they do have, because if we'll start violating the rights of the criminals, again, like I said a few minutes ago, we will violate the rights of everyone at some point. The due process basically means fundamental fairness. It doesn't matter whether you stole a piece of peppermint candy from the Shell station or you hacked your mother to death with a butcher knife. You still are afforded the same rights, privileges, in the criminal justice system once you are accused of a crime. You have certain rights, and we'll be talking about those a little later. This objective says lists the major issues in criminal justice today, and these are what I would consider to be the usual suspects of the major issues. All of those are still current issues in criminal justice, and I don't think those are going to change. However, I think one of the major, more current issues in criminal justice is the public's perception of the police, the media's false reporting about law enforcement, especially in the wake of Ferguson and Baltimore and some of those cases. but also police misconduct. And I'm not really sure that police misconduct is on the rise, but I am sure that the media is picking up on it more than they ever have before. And so what it does is it degrades the trust that people have for policing. And so I think that is definitely a current issue right now. There's going to be, chances in the discussions to talk about these current issues, and I think you need to try to weigh in on some of those. All right. That in a nutshell is Chapter 1. It's basically just an introduction to the criminal justice system. I covered quite a bit. This PowerPoint actually covers quite a bit, but there's no substitute for reading. You have to read the chapters here. So please get in there, read the chapters each week, and then we'll have some discussions each week in regard to those chapters, and then I will also have a lecture here each week. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me, email me, give me a call, text me, whatnot, and I'm there for you. Have a good week, and I'll see you next week for the Integrity Lecture. Bye-bye.